In February 2023, the Welsh Government issued a press release. Wales sets out ambitious plan, with hope at its heart, to reach goal of becoming the most LGBTQ+-friendly nation in Europe. This is an accolade that the European region of the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans and Intersex Association, IGLYO, have, for a number of years, awarded to Malta, a country that has introduced self-ID. Pink News publicised the fact and, along with Stonewall, bemoaned the UK's drop to 17th place. The Prime Minister of Malta from 2013 until 2020, Joseph Muscat, was very pleased.
We look forward to welcoming our friend to Malta. We are so proud of the #1 spot that we retain in the ILGA list, and we're not done yet.
Paul Dillane is a gay man from South Wales who, like Jeremy Miles, experienced homophobia in his youth. From 2017 to 2019, he was the Executive Director of Kaleidoscope Trust, the leading UK charity advocating for the rights of LGBTI people globally. As he explained in an event held in the Senedd in 2018, like Miles, he became a lawyer with an intent to make change.
I started my human rights career in Swansea. I chose to pursue a career in law because at the time I felt very much that I was, and people like me, still a second-class citizen. Section 28 was still law. Societal attitudes in Swansea towards LGBT people, in my view, had not changed significantly. A great deal of stigma and even violence within our community. It gives me great pleasure to see the progress that has been achieved in my country over the course of the last 10, 15, 20 years. And many of the pioneers of our movement are here. We stand on the shoulders of giants. But of course, there's so much more to do, at home and abroad.
At a Queer Asia conference in 2017, Dillane praised the achievements of the Maltese government.
We hope to continue our dialogues with the leaders of these former countries and other leaders, like, for instance, Prime Minister Muscat of Malta, which, as I say, has led the way on trans and intersex inclusion in the lead up to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting next year.
Dillane also stated,
"But I would urge the governments of Britain, Australia and Canada to leave the platform, to share the platform with others, like President Mahai, President Chisano, Prime Minister Muscat and the LGBT activists themselves."
And again, he stated,
"I've already said that Malta is leading the way on the inclusion of trans and intersex people. Malta has been declared in the Rainbow Index the most LGBTI inclusive country in this region."
And once more, he stated,
"Why doesn't the British government and others like Canada sit down at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting with the government of Malta, with Maltese civil society, to learn from, to look at best practice from the trans and intersex initiatives there?"
Others have been less complimentary of the Maltese government. Daphne Caruana Galizia was an investigative journalist and anti-corruption activist who wrote for Maltese papers and had her own blog called Running Commentary. She was highly critical of the Maltese political establishment and has been described as a one-woman WikiLeaks. Muscat was a member of the European Parliament until he became leader of Malta's Labour Party. When he was serving in the European Parliament, he was a member of the EU-Azerbaijan Parliamentary Committee. He was elected as Prime Minister in 2013. In 2014, Galizia published an article questioning the close relationship between the family of the Azerbaijan's leader and the family of the Maltese Prime Minister. In 2016, Galizia published an article on how Maltese banks were facing a reputational crisis with allegations of money laundering. In April 2017, an article in the Malta Independent stated, "There are a number of hard facts about Malta's seemingly increasingly cosy relationship with the faraway country known best for its oil and gas exports as well as for its corruption." In November 2017, Galizia was assassinated by a car bomb An inquiry into the car bomb assassination has singled out the country's former Prime Minister, Joseph Muscat, and his entire cabinet as bearing responsibility for the murder that shocked much of the world. As researcher Malcolm Clark writes, in Malta, Daphne said woke policies were prioritised, not despite the fact they were hard for the public to grasp, but because of it. The more voters struggled to get their heads around legends like no a la carte intent to fight transphobia, the less they'd spot corruption. Clark sees the same policies that were implemented in Malta being attempted to be implemented in Wales. In 2017, Dillane was a signatory to the Yogyakarta Principles plus 10. The original Yogyakarta Principles, signed in 2006, are a set of principles that aim to protect against discrimination of individuals on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. They were agreed at a gathering of 29 human rights advocates from across the world at a meeting in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, in November 2006. This was the first time that sexual orientation and gender identity were linked. Although not approved by the United Nations, the language of the document mirrors the language used in international rights law and aims for the application of the same human rights legislation for persons of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. It is not clear who paid for the meeting or on what basis the invitations were extended. However, as the invitations did not extend to experts on therapeutic treatment of gender dysphoria, clearly the organisers were only interested in seeing one aspect of the trans issue, that relating to the rights of the individual. Anna Zobnina explains how it started.
Just to make it clear that the Yogyakarta Principles, I think that they should be viewed as a project of a civil society organization called ARC International, based in Canada. As many of you probably work or volunteer in civil society organizations, so you can imagine that once you could sit in your office or at home and decide to create a document, something that would further the rights of a specific group of persons that, whose rights you're working to protect. So this is more or less what happened here. It is not a document that has been adopted or discussed by the international community, by the United Nations General Assembly, for example. It is something that came out of a group, and it can be called, I think, rightfully a lobbyist group, because this is how they describe actually themselves. Their sole purpose is to lobby within international institutions, United Nations agencies, and different committees. So it's an idea kind of put forward by them and sponsored by them.
ARC International have received nearly $1 million directly or indirectly from the Arcus Foundation. The head of the Arcus Foundation, John Stryker, is heir to a multi-billion-dollar medical corporation. The Stryker Corporation make money from gender reassignment surgery. Principle 3 of the Yogyakarta Principles calls for the replacement in law of sex with gender identity in all circumstances. It is effectively self-ID. This has alarmed women's groups. Kate Harris from LGBT Alliance explains.
Well, I think one of the problems with we'll call them YP, and there's not just one set of YP, but there's two. There's YP that was put together in 2006, which was the first set of principles. And then there was YP plus 10, which were actually adopted in 2017, which are even crazier than the originals. I think we often say that the pathway to hell is paved with good intentions, and we can definitely apply that to YP. In 2006, a group of people got together. If you actually look on the website about YP, it describes a distinguished group of international human rights experts. Well, They may have been distinguished, but they've been distinguished by the chaos that they've wreaked, unfortunately. They decided to have a set of international principles which related to sexual orientation and gender identity. So therein we have the problem. Let's think about 2006. We know that one of the original authors of the original YP has now changed his mind and deeply regrets the results of what was a very well-intentioned exercise. He has explained that in 2006, and actually quite often now, sex and gender are used interchangeably. And when they wrote the original YP, they used the terms sex and gender interchangeably. Now, why is that a problem? Let's go straight into how does this affect us today. Let's look at what's happening with international rugby, shall we? This is a cause dear to the heart of LGB Alliance because World Rugby has conducted a serious scientific review back in February to look at women's rugby and to look at the question of whether male-bodied individuals who are trans women should be allowed to play. And the science tells us that people who've been through male puberty increase the risk of injury to biological women if they're playing rugby by between 25 and 30%. Now, gender identity theorists tell us that trans women are women and they should be allowed to play against biological women. And this is a campaign that's live right now because Stonewall is described today in the Daily Mail as a trans lobby group, is actively campaigning against World Rugby. World Rugby hasn't issued its report yet, but it's been leaked. And each rugby union in each country in November will have to vote on this issue of women's rugby. And we say put the safety of women first. There are plenty of lesbians who enjoy rugby. But this is one example of the conflation of sex and gender, because not only is it biologically incorrect, but the implications of it are it poses a danger to women in sport. It confuses children. I don't know whether you know that now people who are same-sex attracted, homosexuals, LGB Alliance, we are transphobic if we exclude male-bodied trans women from our dating pool and relationships and sex. So this is another practical example of when you conflate sex and gender, because many groups now say trans women are women. That is a mantra. And therefore, if you don't want to have relationships with them, you're transphobic. We strongly object to that and we campaign against that. We know that lesbians now have nowhere to go. Young lesbians growing up are told that their sex doesn't matter. They're probably trans if they don't conform to 1950s gender stereotypes. I was speaking to someone in the US yesterday who said if you walk through San Francisco at the moment, go down the Castro, there's not a single butch dyke hanging out in any of the bars because they are generally, the popular theory in California is that if you're a butch dyke, you're actually a bloke. So this is all part of what is the result of the theory that's been presented as best practice in the YP.
Kate Harris is articulating something which is blindingly obvious to most. But Jeremy Miles is adamant.
But our trans friends are still denied basic rights. They've got battles still to win, and we are there with them.
Principle 3 of the YP has been accepted by the Welsh Government, who committed to allowing self-ID.
Whether it's devolution of the GRA, which we absolutely want to see and we will continue to campaign for.
Principle 31 in YP plus 10 calls for the removal of sex from every identity document. This has been approved by Paul Dillane. At the AGM of the UK Parliament's All-Parliamentary Group for LGBT plus Rights in January 2019, Paul Dillane announced that a new administrator would be supporting the APPG. The successful candidate was Anna Robinson. Anna Robinson had a notable track record. It was she who, in her role as co-chair of IGLYO, the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer and Intersex Youth and Student Organisation, who commissioned the report that became known as the Dentons document. The report, titled Only Adults, Good Practices and Legal Gender Recognition for Youth, was produced by one of the world's biggest law firms, Dentons, in association with one of the world's biggest media companies, the Thomson Reuters Foundation. The report, which is a guide for activists, makes reference to the Yogyakarta Principles +10 and lists rights and obligations, good practices, and suggests tactics to lobby for the legal recognition of the gender identity of minors. The rights and obligations include right to development of the child. States must protect the physical, mental, moral, social, cultural, spiritual development of children. For example, states should take action against parents who are obstructing the free development of a young trans person's identity in refusing to give parental authorization when required. The report also recommended that changes be made below the radar. M.K. Thane and Sasha White discuss the Dentons document.
Yeah, so there was this document put out in 2019 that's called Only Adults, Good Practices and Legal Gender Recognition for Youth. And it's this report put together by various different networks, including the Thomas Reuters Foundation and various other kind of like international NGO types. And the report is centered around what are some good practices for different organizations to take when advocating for trans rights for youth specifically. And a lot of this report is talking about the impact that media and public debate has on trans rights for youth specifically. And the overarching theme in this report is that you want to get your legislation out into the government ahead of any media attention, that you essentially want to avoid attention in the media and limit public debate, because when debate happens, then opposition has arisen as a result. And they frame this as a bad thing. So, for example, one of the things says, in certain countries like the UK, information on legal gender recognition reforms has been misinterpreted in the mainstream media, and opposition has arisen as a result. They say they recommend that organizations get ahead of the media story. And they say there's a real risk that where advocates fail to intervene early, sensitizing the media and the public to trans rights in general, the legal gender recognition in particular, persists negative and pernicious narratives about trans rights. Agenda may take hold in the public imagination, which will negatively influence the legislative process and prospects for success. And they recommend that NGOs basically avoid excessive coverage in the media. That's a direct quote from them, that NGOs have observed that excessive coverage in the media means much of the debate has been confused and does not actually discuss the point at issue, being legal gender recognition, but rather intertwines it with discussion regarding medical surgeries. This is something that NGOs in the UK have had to try to counteract because of the media attention that they're receiving in that country. So all of this is, and we'll put a link to this in the description. I really recommend reading the whole report because it's actually a really good handbook for gender critical advocates on what you should be doing. It's essentially just the opposite of everything that they're doing, like get attention on the issue, because I think the trans activists have really found a way to weaponize these silencing tactics to get things happening under the radar, to make people so afraid to speak out that there is no public debate, because they know that if there's a public debate, they're going to lose it. Mm-hmm. And so they have to just work with these silencing tactics. They've really found a way to make silence benefit them. when it's someone else's silence, but even their own, because they don't recommend going to the media and doing interviews about why you support this bill that you're lobbying your representative to. They don't want you to do that. They want you to be quiet, even as a trans activist in the media. And I think that's really interesting.
That is fascinating. It makes me think of us. We have broken out of the silence and the silencing, right? And we're speaking loud and clear.
Several non-governmental organisations contributed to the Dentons document. The only organisation that wished to remain anonymous was from the UK. Stonewall have a very close relationship with Dentons. From February 2019 until August 2020, Anna Robinson's position was funded by Kaleidoscope Trust, Stonewall and Frontline AIDS. It is difficult to see how an individual who commissioned a report that advised activists to achieve their aims through subterfuge can be an impartial administrator to a democratic parliamentary group. Jeremy Miles uses the same tactic of no debate. David Sampson is a former lawyer and the deputy director of the Bearing Foundation. They have taken over the funding of the Secretariat for the all-party parliamentary group on LGBT plus rights. He is also executive committee co-chair for the Global Philanthropy Project, a consortium of heavily funded philanthropic organisations that include the Arcus Foundation,